My name is Bernard Sweeney. I'm an Irish traveller and I'm based here in the Republic of Ireland. And I'm doing a short video basically on what I understand, my education, my experiences, and that's as much as an authoritative figure I can be on that and that alone. I do not speak on behalf of other travellers. I'm doing this video in black and white because it could not be any more black and white what I have to say. It's worth mentioning, or if it's worth mentioning, I do not have any formal qualifications. I did not attend third level education institutions. I did not return to school, and I have no degrees, PhDs, or any other certification that would suggest that I am an expert on what I'm saying. But what I am talking about, or I will talk about, is my own lived personal experiences, my own understanding of my own education from a particular community, from a particular mentality, and a particular background. The settled education versus a traveller education. First, let's clear up a few bits and pieces before we get into this. As mentioned, Irish traveller. That makes up at 0.7, I believe, percent of the Irish population. So we're around the 40, 50,000 people out of about 4.2, 4.3 million people, thereabouts, roughly, give or take a few people. So that will give you some image. So the Republic of Ireland, once a green slate, now the majority are the settled Irish, and a fraction of a minority are the Irish travellers. Of course, in the north of Ireland, you've got the Protestant Irish. And so, yeah, you've got Catholic, Protestant Irish. Of course, you've got other minorities, other communities, but these are the somewhat historical mentalities. Now, I'll use the word mentality because when I say mentality, I refer to sometimes as people's cultures. It's not a generalization. If you think about it, our cultures is our mentality, our ideas, our visions, our dreams, everything we've taken in, everything we grew up with, everything we were absorbed with. These constitute as culture and the identity of culture. Even if the culture changes, the identity can remain the same. I'll give you a good example. I'm here now speaking in the English language. The English language is not our language, so therefore we are participating in a language that is not ours, but actually a colonial language. So without making it too complicated, the whole idea of this racism, I'm going to give you some examples, and then you decide for yourself. You make up your own mind. You can say, well, that's not possible. That's not true. That's lies. But all of this is backed up with science and historical recorded evidence. So there isn't much room for maneuvering in terms of is it true, is it not true? We know it to be true. So this is what we're going to do, we're going to try to do. As I mentioned, I come from the Irish traveller community, not an ethnic minority, an indigenous minority. And we were not always the minority. Our mentality, our culture is one of the oldest cultures on the island. As mentioned, it goes back thousands of years, and that continues. When a culture changes, the identity can remain the same. We know our people, we know our ancestors, all these colonial labels, from travellers, tinkers, itinerants, vagrants, woods people, bogs people, hedge people, wanderers. Even if we adapted names ourselves, such as tinkers, itinerant, or minkers, pavies, all these labels and counter labels or adapting labels or owning labels are all part of a colonial history. So to give you some context in this, we're going to have to start from the 1600s. And I think people get kind of, what the hell has that got to do back then to do with now? I could start now. And maybe if it was a start now, we would start with Irish travellers, with one of the worst health crises of any community in Ireland, I would say any community in Europe. We have a life expectancy of 65 years old. Most travellers do not get there. I think 50, slightly plus 50% are dead at the age of 40. 11% of our community is made up with suicides. Self-harm, conflict, internalized oppression, anger, pain. There's been isolation, there's been exclusion, there's been persecution, there's been acts, laws, policies, there's been apartheid systems, there's been forced assimilation, there's been segregation, there has been industrial homes that snatched the children from our people. This is going back in the last few decades. Some of these systems are still in place. Today, if you want to start from today, this is why we're dying. We've got our NGOs, organisations. They've got programs. They're not the best in the world. It's not their fault. But as it goes, despite all the funding, despite all the investment, despite all the programs, despite the so-called best education, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've seen our health statistic and all other statistics go spiral downwards. In other words, we'd be more happier to be dead than to be alive in Ireland. This is seen as almost a self-suffering community, and nobody understands how to address it. Nobody understands how to get around it, how to work with it, how to fix it, how to mend it. And this has been prolonged over a long period of time, not with people with ill intentions or the worst intentions. Sometimes it's with the best intentions. But the situation we have, statistically, you can see this decline constantly. So we know it's psychological, because we got some of the finest athletes in the world in various different sports for a very small community. So when I say we'll start with the 1600s, from the 1600s, you'll understand why we are dying in today's, the present moment, this time, and so on and so forth. So with the 1600s, we call it the Elizabethan conquest. A lot of this information I would have absorbed from great historian Dylan Foley, based here in Sligo, which I was very fortunate to have bumped into. It was great context, great framework. It's not because I absorbed everything he's telling me. It's not because I read in one book or another book or YouTube or anything like that. I'm not a very avid reader. Like I mentioned, I did not go back to education. And the various education I had learned in life came as a learnative way. And I mean that in terms of I knew I was looking for something, but I didn't know what it was. I knew it was something to do with the settler mentality and the traveller mentality, that there was something not quite right here, that bombarded day and night we were. As I mentioned, the institutionalizations, the segregation, the apartheid systems, the overrepresentation in prisons, 84% unemployed. All of these statistics, all of these issues, all of these problems did not exist in our community only a few decades ago. So when I say we start at the 1600s, it's all connected. It is not a place in time. It's not documentary recorded. It's not something that's just in a book. That's how settled people look at things. That's how settled people document history, times, events, and places. And then they believe it's gone and it goes away. History doesn't work like that. If something happened in the past that is hurting, if not destroying the entire planet, let alone the traveller community in Ireland, and when I say the traveller community, when we go back into history, these labels change. Remember when I said travellers, thinkers, itinerants, like go back to decades, go back to centuries. We weren't always called the one label. So when we go back so far, you'll find that there's a lot of Irish settled people with the same skin complexion, the same nationality, the same surnames, and they believe themselves to be the Irish, and then they believe we are something else, other. And again, 1963, that was based on the 1600s Elizabethan conquest. In 1963, the Irish government had commissioned their own report, and it was almost identical to the Elizabethan conquest. So this is the echoes of time. This is a one continuous event. This is not different parts. So if I were to say something like colonization, imperialism, and capitalism, you might be forgiven to think that they are three different stages in time. I would say and strongly put forward that they're not. They're one continuous event in time. So again, hence, speaking in the English language, not our language. And the language itself has an origin, so it has a beginning. And according to linguistics and other experts, it is not like any other human language. In other words, it doesn't kind of have the same origins, same nature, environment, and yeah, it's different. And you see how it's constructed. It was actually made up of various other languages. The words they were using are from colonial powers themselves. The French, the German, the Dutch, Spanish, wherever it might have been, it constituted this language through trade and business. So this is about 1500 years ago. I know that's gone back quite a bit. But then again, listen, we're still using the same language that was constructed 1500 years ago by somebody else. So that hasn't changed. Do you see how history doesn't change? So to the 1600s, their idea was to shift the Irish mentality away from the Irish people. Not lower them and re-educate them. I mean, from the strictest, hardest, cruelest ways possible, to take this Irish mentality, this thousands of years of culture, a culture of the Gaels, a culture that had even existed before the Gaels. But you're talking 4,000 years of Celtic culture. That's a lot. It's a lot of culture. That's 2,000 years before Jesus was born. But so go back to Neolithical people. Well, Neolithical people, yeah, we say they're also intelligent people, crafty people, survivalists, so on and so forth. That's 6,000 years ago. But forward, where we are, we came from our parents came from their parents, and so on and so forth and so on. So these are the same people, same labels, same trades, same cultures, same people, right the whole way back to now. But in the Elizabethan conquest around the 1600s, there were many people, but one very influential character was a guy called Edmund Spencer. And again, I got a lot of this from Dylan Foley, which I greatly appreciate. But it makes sense in the path I was coming from. And a lot of travellers will get this, feel this, that we know we're not the settled community. We're not against the settled community. And we know that we got family now in there, married, connected. And we also see travellers trying to become settled people because they're being rewarded by the system to be obedient. I know that sounds a bit kind of crazy, but I think people might get an understanding or a grasp of where I'm coming with this. So when I say an old culture, an ancient culture, Celtic culture, I'm talking about a culture that's still alive today. One that all the historians have written off and do not or want anything to do with it. We see it even today. Irish travellers are the most excluded people in Ireland. Even today, we are the most ill-treated, mistreated minority in Ireland today. And no minority gets it great, I can tell you. But we even get it worse than that again. And we've got reports from their National Police Service questionnaires and ridiculing travellers. And I mean, not even ridiculing, they're speaking their natural true feelings of what they were thinking. And it was just brutal. So we look at the statistics of travellers dying on, we look at the psychological abuse and the systematic abuse and the colonisation and the imperialism. You're wondering, it's not science to figure out there's a connection here. And where we make even a broader connection, I come back to Elizabethan conquest, is that if you take India, if you take China, if you take Japan, if you take New Zealand, Canada, USA, you take all of these other places this English colonial beast had been to, you will see the impact and the chaos and the fallout from that process. Again, not necessarily the English fault, it's a long time ago. The people who created that colonial system are dead 500 years ago at least. But there's a lot more that goes into that. I don't want to overcomplicate this. As I'm saying, as an Irish traveller with no formal education. So where did I get these words? And where did I get to know these understandings? Of course, I went looking for them as part of my education of searching in the first place. So the whole situation here in Ireland, 1600s, the connections we have around the world with the other indigenous minorities, ethnic minorities such as African Americans, Native Americans, indigenous people, Roma, all these communities look like from the inside as being almost outsiders. Couldn't make it, couldn't cut it, and are inferior. And then of course they reward those of us from such communities to participate in the rules of the system, and they get posted like poster children and so on and so forth. And it looks like then the system is wonderful and it's great. But the 1600s didn't go away. The 1600s, through people like Edmund Spencer and the brainwashing and the shifting of the mentality and embedding great levels of shame by acts and laws, the thing they call the penal laws, persecuting people for being culturally alert, culturally conscious, their language, their traditions, their way of being. Everything and anything was to be an Irish person, was to be white, attacked, verbalized, demonized, shamed into non-existence. And you'll see that today with the west of Ireland and the east of the island, where even the west of Ireland gets left out psychologically of the national development plans, and physically also, but psychologically they were not even thinking of these people. This is a small island. So again, I don't want to make it overcomplicated. So we're going with travellers, ethnic minority. We know Edmund Spencer had a lot of bad ideas, how to shift and change the mentality. We know the Elizabethan conquest had its impact. So why does all that matter? Why is it that today, in 2021, there's an Irish traveller telling you that it does matter? And it's very important that we talk about it. Because in 1922, Ireland had never changed any of the colonial systems. Now, remember, Ireland was one of the first overseas countries to be colonised centuries. Dublin was the pale, was a port, was a docking port for London. It was English people for the best part of 1,000 years. So when they colonised it, and more so part of the invasion, 500 years later and 500 years ago, they were highly fine-tuned institutions, systems. So Dublin had never changed that mentality. So in 1922, there was also a guy called David Lloyd George, I believe. He was the Prime Minister of England. And his grand plan was, again, to mimic and copy the 1600 report, or the 1600 Elizabethan conquest. And that was once again to shift the mentality, but this time to shift it from the Dublin perspective. They had it from the London, and were using Dublin as a port. But if London was gone, how would you keep the mentality going, and so on and so forth. So Dublin became the home away from home for London. So they created the Irish Settlement Plan. Now, the whole idea of the Elizabethan conquest was to civilise Ireland and settlise them and tax them up to the ears and so on and so forth. Well, you know a lot of this history to be true. So there's nothing I'm saying here that's not necessarily untrue. And if it's a bit off here and there, so be it. I'm not claiming to be an historian. I'm an Irish traveller that grew up in a very hostile environment, have seen a lot of pain, death and misery, and we'd like it to end. So 1922, nothing had changed. The institutions, the education, the laws, the acts, everything. What would that matter? Well, if you look at it here again today, we have a situation where Irish travellers are othered. Other means a people who have been turned upon by society. Turned upon by society with the direction and the power of a 1963 Commission report into itinerancy, another one of the many labels they were calling Irish travellers. This particular report was a copy of the 1922 Lloyd George idea of colonising the rest of Ireland, again for Dublin. The Elizabethan conquest was about colonising Ireland with Dublin. And if you're thinking, did Dublin get colonised at any time? No, Dublin always had a free trade with London. That was London. They were English people. So their Anglo-Irish agreement was just an Anglo-Irish agreement because both were Irish-English. In other words, they were born here a few generations later, but they maintained and kept all of the English traditions and the values. So it suited them not to change it. They clearly it was for economical reasons. But look around the world. Look around Australia, America, all these places. They're all sharing the same linguistic Frankenstein's monster of a language. Nothing against the English people. Absolutely not. We're sharing the language. We're using the language. We're communicating in it. But people automatically assume we're somehow or another we've always spoken this language. And if we haven't spoken, we're speaking it now and we are this language. That is not how the language works. In 1922, seen to that. You'll see it in the west of Ireland. You'll see it in Mayo. They don't get greatly treated. There's a lot of settled people, townspeople, farmers, getting ill-treated, excluded. But there isn't a community in Ireland at this present moment. Maybe for those, I can't call them a community, direct provisions. They're just modern-day slavery. It was taken from the old slavery, but now more modernised, because we've never come out of colonisation. We've never come out of imperialism. We've never come out of capitalism, because they were all one event by a very strict ruling class. Dublin is, again, it's not anti-Dublin, it's not anti-Protestant, it's not anti-English. English were colonised themselves. I'm referring to the language. Before the English, there was the British. The British were the Britons, the Britannia. Same, pretty much the same culture as everybody else. But the Saxons and the Vikings and so on and so forth, and the Saxons, Anglos and the Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Druids, whoever else was in there, part of the invasion created England, dominated and so on and so forth, and created this language. And its very origins were take, kill, sleep. It was a very blunt language, you can see that. It was missing a lot of the other natural elements of environment, trees, meaning, philosophy. And its first book in the English language was about a werewolf killing people. My point is that what if the colonisation had never stopped? What if the Irish travellers are the key to understanding global issues, let alone local ones? That our culture and our mentality is still different from the settled one. That we've got a version of history we'd like to share with you. That it isn't anti-settled or anti-anything. It's pro-humanity. And more so, and I'm hoping that if you are black, that if you're Asian, that if you're wherever you are in the world, or whatever you perceive this language to be, or whatever you see the Western colonial world to be, I can assure you Ireland was never part of the colonial system. Ireland had its own deep language. No different from other languages, just another way of communicating, but we found the skills and the ways of communicating what they call the Irish language and a couple of other languages. So that was our communication. It was an honour-based society. It wasn't an economist-based society. We didn't even have money, but yeah, we had thousands of years of a complex history. We were called the lands of the saints and the scholars. So we were an educated, intelligent people. We had scientists. We had doctors. We had laws against the death penalty in the 5th century. We had island hospitals to look after our elderly, the disabled. We did not frown or look down or put down people. There was no racism in the Celtic culture. We know that even for centuries across Britain, even with the Romans. There was open trade. It's when the English language came along, with no disrespect. Supremacy maybe. Something tripped, something went wrong somewhere. Because it changed the whole biological framework of the people that had it and the people that forcefully shared it. And then you'll see this around the world, you'll see it in India. And inside this particular mentality, this colonial mentality, they are as much the victims as we are. Because the vast majority in Ireland, even this present moment, do not know who Irish travellers are. They still think we're something other. One time somebody told us to go back to our own country. Now that'll give you an idea of the imperial mentality and how embedded it has become. But that doesn't mean we can't change it. This doesn't mean you give up your way of life, you stop doing things. This just makes you a little more consciously aware that something isn't quite right. And there's a lot we can do to fix this. I want to send out my love, compassion, solidarity with just about everyone on the planet. This is a very complicated story that spans at least 5 centuries and has become global. The language itself was designed from systems and trade. If you look at today, you'll see global economies are linked into that particular mentality. You'll see countries are ran like companies. And again, people might say, what's this way, that way? You're being limited so much through the education system, because the education system itself is ran by the people who run the companies. Like they are like nothing more than a terminal into manufacturing. Again, there's nothing wrong with these lives and these roles and these jobs. But when it's imposed upon you and restricts you from being you, labels you and cuts you off and steals your identity, that cannot exist. Because you're not robbing us just of our identity. You're robbing yourself of your own identity. And if you're preaching the wrong lessons of life, how do you expect any right outcomes to come from it? So my solidarity is all over the world, and I hope I didn't complicate this too much. No matter who you are or where you are, there's a mentality, a particular origin mentality. It's embedded into the Chinese governments, Japanese, everywhere in the world, one way or the other. It's foreign policies, it's one way or the other. Again, it's not these people's fault. They are being programmed since they were children, for generation after generation, for centuries after century, to be a particular way in this mentality. And that's to be successful, to be number one, to be greedy, to take, cutthroat, politics, so on and so forth. Religion didn't help it, but they're all intertwined when it comes to today, because the 1600s kicked off our history with the introduction of a systematic mentality / language that has played havoc with the world ever since. So with that, my friends, Ireland says no to racism because racism is stupid. It's a colonized, defunct concept. We'll have to come up with a new term for it. It doesn't mean that racism isn't real or the effects of racism isn't real, but the people who are giving us this racist treatment are actually decolonized. They might be traumatizing our communities, but they're actually traumatized. They're in absolute denial of what has happened to them. So if we can start with Ireland, because we have to start there sooner or later. And again, this will come through the art. I'm with the Rural Red, thanks to people like Liz Hayes, Thomas McCarthy, and Melissa O'Boyle, and people like that. We're going to be making documentaries, trying to create a traveller platform, because it's outside of all the mentalities. It's outside of the colonial mentality. because we are not our language. We are only the people that are putting words together in a form of communicating with each other. We think differently. You could have an Irish traveller, Irish settled, an English, an Australian, an American, no matter who they are. And we could all be talking and engaging in this one same language. That doesn't mean we're all thinking the same. It doesn't mean we all mean the same things. Interpretations and different ways of understanding the world. But if we do get to that point where we believe the English language is our language, it's a beautiful language, and so on and so forth, and there is no other languages, we're in serious, serious trouble. Now you might say, well, I can speak other languages. I can, and I don't feel any different. You can say, well, I can learn different languages, or I speak Irish, or any language. Remember, the language itself is a program that dominates the limbic system, the mentality I call it, and influences the cortex, the frontal lobe. So if your environment around you was created by a particular mentality from somewhere else, doesn't that mean our reality is shaped by somebody else's mentality, their systems? And if it isn't ours in the very beginning and it hasn't changed right up to this point, how could you be independent? How could you be possibly free? Free from what? My friends, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.